The pen barely made a sound when Callum signed his name to the settlement agreement, and that was the part that seemed to unsettle everyone in the room more than anything else. No raised voice, no last-ditch argument, no trembling hand or wet eyes. He simply read the page one final time, set it flat on the table, and put his signature where the attorney had placed the small yellow arrow. Then he capped the pen and set it down with the same care he used for everything, quietly, in the right place. Nadine watched him from across the table, with an expression that had taken her years to perfect. Not triumph exactly, something more measured than that. The look of a woman who had spent the better part of a month anticipating this moment and found it arriving exactly on schedule. Her attorney gathered the papers into a clean stack. Nadine smoothed the front of her blazer with one hand and reached for her coffee with the other. Callum rose without a word, picked up his jacket from the back of the chair, and walked out of that office on the 14th floor of a building in downtown Vancouver, with a canvas bag over one shoulder and his 5-year-old daughter asleep against the other, her small face tucked into the side of his neck, her fingers curled into the collar of his shirt. The afternoon light outside was the particular gray of a West Coast October, low and even, the kind of sky that holds everything at the same temperature. Everyone left in that conference room believed they had just watched a man lose. The story did not begin there. It began 2 years earlier in a rented house in East Vancouver, on a street where the maple trees had gone the color of rust. And the mornings arrived cold and particular. Callum Dyer worked best in the hours after the rest of the house had exhaled. He was 41, a structural engineer by training, who had spent the last several years doing contract work for mid-sized construction firms that needed someone who could read a problem slowly and solve it, without needing to be admired for it. He did not go into an office. He did not have a business card that impressed anyone at dinner parties. What he had was a daughter named Iris who was 4 years old and who needed someone who was reliably, completely there. He packed her lunch every morning in a container with a small drawing tucked inside because she had told him once that she liked finding things. He knew which coat she would fight about putting on and which songs played from the car's speakers turned tantrums into singing. He knew the name of the stuffed rabbit who had to be within arm's reach at bedtime, and the name of the smaller rabbit who was the first one's friend and who could not be forgotten either. He had organized his entire working life around the fact that his daughter needed picking up at 3:15. To anyone watching from the outside, this made Callum a man who had rendered his professional ambition to his wife's. Nadine Ashworth was 38 and ran the Western Canadian operations of a large commercial real estate firm. She moved through the world the way people do when they have learned that rooms adjust to them rather than the other way around. Sharp in the way that reads as confidence before you know them, and something else once you do. She had married Callum when they were both at the beginning of things, when ambition and warmth and the future had all seemed like parts of the same sentence. Somewhere in the years since, they had become different sentences. Sentences that no longer ran on the same page. She did not know what he did in the evenings, or she had decided it was nothing, which is a different thing. What Callum did in the evenings, after Iris was asleep and the house had settled, was sit at the desk in the small back room and work on a structural analysis software system he had been building for 4 years. Not for anyone, not on contract, for himself, because he had seen the same problem come up on job site after job site. The gap between what the engineering software could model and what the actual building conditions required. And because he was the kind of person who, when he saw a persistent problem, could not stop thinking about it until he had solved it. He had used none of their shared money to build it. That had been a decision made quietly, the way Callum made most decisions, without announcing it. His grandmother had died 3 years before the marriage and left him a modest amount. Not a fortune, but enough. And he had kept it in an account in his name alone because it had arrived to him alone, and it had seemed right. From that account he had paid for the software licenses, the server costs, the 2 second-hand monitors that sat on the desk in the back room and threw blue light across the wall at midnight. When the system had taken enough shape that it had an identity, he had registered the intellectual property in his own name. He told himself it was administration. He went back to work. Nadine never asked about the back room, or she asked once early on, in the comfortable, half-curious way of someone who expects an ordinary answer and gets one. Callum had said something about project work, and she had nodded, and that had been the end of it. There had been a time when she would have followed up, would have asked to see it, would have sat on the edge of the desk and made him explain it to her. But that time had passed, and neither of them had marked the day it went. The night the marriage ended did not feel to Callum like the night the marriage ended. It felt like a conversation that had been practiced somewhere else before it arrived in their kitchen. Nadine came home on a Thursday in November, set her keys on the counter, and told him she wanted a divorce. Her voice was level, professional almost, the voice of a woman who has prepared for a presentation and delivered it cleanly. She had already spoken to a lawyer, she said. She did not want this to become complicated. They had grown in different directions. It was not angry, which was the part that stayed with him later. Anger would have been easier to hold on to. He was standing at the counter with a dish towel in his hands when he understood, in the space of about 4 seconds, several things at once. He understood that the decision was old. She was not arriving at it tonight. She was announcing it. He understood something else she had not said. For the past few months, a name had surfaced on her phone with a regularity that had nothing to do with work, even though she worked very hard to give it that shape. A colleague, a contact, introduced once at a firm function as a regional director named Preston, who shook Callum's hand with the precise, managed warmth of someone who knows more than they are showing. Callum had not gone looking. He simply lived in the same house and paid attention. He folded the dish towel along its crease and set it down. What unsettled him was not divorce. He had felt the marriage cooling for long enough that the word had lost most of its shock. What unsettled him came 3 days later in the language of the proposal her lawyer had drafted and sent over on a Tuesday afternoon. Nadine was seeking primary custody of Iris, the family home, the shared accounts. In exchange, Callum was offered standard alternating weekends and a Wednesday dinner, a corridor. The reasoning was outlined in careful, polite legal language that managed to be devastating without raising its voice. Callum had no stable employment, no fixed income a court could document and weigh, no significant property in his name, no business, no assets. A man in that position, the document implied without ever quite saying it, could not provide a child with a stable, independent home. He read it twice at the kitchen table while Iris sat across from him eating toast and narrating an elaborate story about a mouse who lived in the wall and had opinions about cheese. He watched her hands move, small and certain and entirely unaware. On paper, they were right. That was the worst of it. Every word was technically accurate. He had done the work that left no record a judge could weigh. For a few days he sat with the easier choice. It was always there, the easier choice, reasonable and even dignified in its way. He could sign. He could take the 2 weekends a month and the Wednesday dinner and stop a legal fight he could not obviously win against a lawyer Nadine's firm could afford to retain indefinitely. There was a kind of quiet in surrender, the quiet of a man who has decided the cost of fighting exceeds the cost of losing. The thing that ended the easier choice happened on a Sunday night. Callum had finished the bedtime routine, bath, the right pajamas located after a search, both rabbits installed in their correct positions. He was sitting on the edge of Iris's small bed in the dark, his hand resting on the blanket beside her, when she turned over and put both arms around his neck the way children do, with no awareness of the weight of the gesture. "Daddy," she said. Her voice was already going soft with the edge of sleep. "Do you live here forever?" It was not a dramatic question. She asked it the way she asked whether clouds were heavier than pillows or whether fish got cold, but it went somewhere beneath his ribs and stayed there. "Yes, sweetheart," he said. His voice came out steadier than the rest of him felt. "I live here with you. I'm not going anywhere." She was asleep within minutes. He stayed sitting in the dark long after her breathing had deepened and her hands had gone loose against his collar. Somewhere on the other side of the city, a proposal was sitting in a lawyer's inbox that had drawn a corridor 2 days wide and called it fatherhood. Callum sat in the dark and let himself understand that he could absorb almost anything they offered him. The house, the accounts. The quiet, ordinary life being divided up by people in suits who had never learned the names of his daughter's rabbits, except the thing he had just promised not to lose. He was not going to sign a single line of it. The decision did not come as anger. Anger was too loud for what he felt and would not have lasted the week. What arrived instead was patience. The same patience that had carried him through 4 years of late nights in the back room. The morning after, once Iris was at school, he made a call he had been circling since the proposal arrived. He had asked around carefully. A friend from a previous job, his brother-in-law, a former client. And the same name had come back each time, with the same tone people use when they want to convey that a name is serious without overstating it. A family lawyer in Burnaby with a reputation for taking cases that looked straightforward on the opposing side and making them complicated. The phone rang once. "Tanner," said the woman answer. The voice of someone who had long since stopped trying to make the first impression more than necessary. "My name is Callum Dyer," he said. "My wife is about to take my daughter, and she thinks I don't have any reason to fight her on it." A pause on the other end. Short, evaluating. "That's a specific way to frame it," the lawyer said. "Most people lead with the house. The house isn't the part that matters." "No," she said, and her tone shifted by a degree. "It usually isn't. Come in Friday morning, 8:30. Bring every financial document you have. Anything she sent you in writing, anything from her lawyer. And Mr. Dyer," a half-beat of quiet. "Don't sign anything before we meet, not a get-well card." He almost said he wasn't the type. He said nothing instead, which was probably the better answer. That evening he made the pasta Iris had requested because she requested it most evenings, and because routine had carried him through harder stretches than this. He listened to a 5-year-old explain a detailed and internally consistent mythology about a kingdom under the floorboards. He did the dishes. He read 3 chapters of a book about a bear who made terrible decisions and learned from them. He tucked Iris in, confirmed both rabbits were present, and then walked down the hall to the back room and turned on the desk lamp. The monitors woke up. The system waited where he had left it. 4 years of evenings, patient and unremarkable. The work no one in that conference room had thought to ask about. He sat down and did not work. He simply looked at it for a long time. And he began, slowly, to understand that the thing he had built in this room might be the only real ground he had to stand on. He just did not yet know how solid that ground was. He did not know that in an office somewhere across the city, a quiet conversation had already happened about a piece of software that matched exactly what he had been building. He did not know that the person who had started that conversation was someone whose name appeared on Nadine's phone with a regularity that had nothing to do with work. He only knew that Iris had asked him if he lived there forever, and that he had said yes. The desk lamp burned past midnight. Outside, the maple on the boulevard had gone bare, and the street was quiet and entirely ordinary, and no one passing by would have guessed that the man inside had just stopped accepting the outcome and started building a different one. Vivienne Tanner's office was on the 2nd floor of a building in Burnaby that smelled like paper and old coffee. She read the proposal once through, all of it, without expression. Then she set it down and looked at Callum the way a doctor looks at a set of results they have read before. "On paper," she said, "you are in a very poor position." He had expected some preamble. He was relieved not to get it. No employment contract. No documented income a court can put a number to. No property in your name. No registered business. No assets they have to account for. She tapped the proposal with one finger. "Her team isn't going to call you a bad father. That's not how it works with lawyers this good. They're going to call you a dependent father. A man who stayed home while his wife built something. They'll be respectful about it. They'll say it like they're complimenting you. That's what makes it work." "There's something they don't know about," Callum said. She waited. He told her about the software. The inheritance from his grandmother kept separate from the first. The account in his name alone. The licenses and server costs paid from that account. Nothing else. The intellectual property registered to him. 4 years of evenings funded by separate money, done in the hours after the house went quiet. Vivienne did not write anything down while he talked, which he would later understand was not inattention. When he finished, she leaned back in her chair. "That's more than you realize," she said. "But understand what we're working with." In British Columbia, property acquired during a marriage is presumed to be family property. The default assumption works against you. What you've just described isn't a finished defense. It's the raw material for one. Separate origin, separate funds, separate account, separate registration. Every piece of that is something I can use. My job is to build it into an argument before her team can pull the pieces apart. She looked at him steadily. "Which means I need every record, every receipt, every timestamp, every confirmation email from every license you ever purchased. We're going to prove this on paper because a judge doesn't have time for anything else." She gave him one instruction before he left that surprised him. "Agree to the divorce," she said. "Sign the dissolution itself. Don't fight that part. You don't want to stay married to her, and a man who appears to be fighting to hold a marriage together against his wife's wishes looks bad in front of a family court judge. But custody, the house, the accounts, the software, you concede nothing. You sign one document, you walk out, and you let her team think you've folded. Sometimes the most important thing you can do in a room is let people read you wrong." 2 weeks later, in the boardroom of Nadine's lawyer's office downtown, that was exactly what Callum did. He signed the single page that ended the marriage. Nothing more. He walked out with Iris asleep on his shoulder into the October afternoon and let every person in that room believe they had just watched him accept the terms. He had not conceded a single thing that mattered. The months that followed showed Callum what it felt like to be worn down by politeness. Nadine's legal team never raised a voice. They applied pressure in small, precise increments, the way you apply weight to something you are confident will eventually give. A request for a psychological evaluation of Callum arrived, framed as routine, as something done in all contested custody proceedings, just a formality, just a box to be ticked. The implication beneath the framing was its own kind of argument. Was he stable? Was he consistent? Could a man who had reduced his professional life to school pickups and evening software projects be trusted to provide a child with what she needed on his own? The question was designed to be unanswerable cleanly. Object too hard, you seem unstable. Accept without comment, you seem to concede the premise, and then the visitation schedule began to change. A Friday pickup became a Saturday because of a scheduling conflict that was never specified. A long weekend was shortened by a day. When Callum called to ask about it, the explanation was polite and entirely unsatisfying. Iris, when he reached her on the phone, sounded fine, bright and talkative, asking when they were going to the park, asking whether the rabbits were okay, asking 3 times whether he was coming soon. The pattern was small enough that any single instance seemed like an inconvenience. Stacked together, they were a slow and deliberate pressure. Nadine was making a calculation that a man who had never liked conflict would eventually find the cost of continuing too high. She had not been wrong about most things. She was wrong about this. Callum did not fold. He did not sleep well either. The thing that changed the shape of everything arrived on a Wednesday afternoon in Vivienne's office. She was looking at something on her screen when she said, without particular drama, "Mr. Dyer, are you aware that someone has made an inquiry about your software?" He went still. "No." She turned the monitor toward him. "A technology investment group based in Toronto, of preliminary expression of interest, unsigned, unpublicized, preliminary in every sense. But the valuation attached to it had 8 figures. Did you approach them?" "I put part of the core engine up as an open repository," he said slowly, "under my own name, just to test whether it could hold up in the open. I never sent it to a fund. I never told anyone it was for sale." He stopped. He had been going to say he was waiting until it was finished before he told Nadine. Vivienne was watching his face with the focused, careful attention of someone who has already done the calculation and it's waiting for the other person to catch up. "Here's what I want you to think about," she said. "I've been in family law for 19 years. I have learned to be careful about timing that looks convenient." She pulled up 2 additional documents on the screen. Nadine filed for divorce on a specific date. I have the timestamps on the proposal, on the early correspondence between her lawyer and the firm's internal legal counsel. And now I have this inquiry, and I have something else. There is a thread of contact through her associate, Preston, that connects to the investment circles the Toronto fund moves in. You're saying she knew about the software. I'm saying the timeline is not an accident. She did not move slowly and happen to catch you at the right moment. She moved fast, faster than the ordinary end of a quiet marriage requires. She pushed for a clean and fast dissolution because the longer this stayed open, the higher the chance that this, she touched the screen, became visible as an asset on the table that she would have to fight you for in plain view of a judge. Callum sat with it. For weeks he had carried himself like a man enduring something. A father who had done the invisible work and could prove very little of it, absorbing the unfairness, because that was what you did when the system was arranged against you. He had even, in his worst moments in the back room after midnight, let himself feel sorry for himself, and then felt ashamed of feeling sorry. But that was not what this was. Nadine had not left because he was a man going nowhere. She had left, and left precisely when she did, in the way she did, because she had become aware that he was a man about to arrive, and she had arranged the exit so that she would be holding the right documents before anyone else understood what was happening. He was not a husband being set aside. He was an asset being quietly separated from its owner before the owner understood its value. The self-pity went out of him like air from a room. What took its place was colder and steadier and far more useful. "All right," he said. "All right," Vivian said, and something shifted slightly at the corner of her mouth. Nadine escalated when she realized he was not going to agree to the offer. It came through Preston, through the loose social connections that people like him maintained, in the way that other people maintain toolboxes, as instruments, kept in good order, used when needed. A fog of uncertainty began to move through the investment circles surrounding the inquiry. Nothing documented, nothing that could be traced cleanly. Just the right conversations. The software? Was the ownership of the software clean? Was the founder in the middle of a custody dispute? Were there unresolved complications? A serious fund would be wise to wait. It was the professional equivalent of the psychological evaluation. An unanswerable question, seeded to grow. And then Nadine came to him in person. Callum had rented a small place in New Westminster for the duration. 2 rooms, a kitchen, a window that looked out on a courtyard where someone had left a bicycle chained to the railing all autumn. He was at the table reviewing documents when the knock came. Iris was asleep in the other room. Nadine stood in the doorway in a coat he did not recognize. She had not come to reconcile. He understood that from the first second. He stepped back to let her in because Iris was sleeping, and he would not have this conversation on the landing. She looked around the small room without comment. Then she made her offer, and she made it well, because making offers was something she understood. He would sign a full settlement and a confidentiality agreement. He would accept a lump sum. Reasonable, she said. Fair. And step back from the custody dispute. In exchange, the pressure on the investment inquiry would stop. The deal would proceed. Nobody had to lose more than they already had. "You're a better father than you'll ever be a businessman, Callum," she said, and her voice was almost gentle. "That's not an insult. I mean it. Don't let pride walk you into a room you weren't built for." Callum looked at her for a moment. Then he opened the door. "Go home, Nadine." She studied him, recalibrating, and then she left, her footsteps precise on the landing stairs, the door pulling shut behind her. He stood in the kitchen for a long time after the sound of her car had faded. The courtyard light threw a thin rectangle across the floor. In the other room, Iris slept with one arm hanging over the edge of the mattress the way she always did, in defiance of all blanket arrangements. He thought about what it would mean to drag a 5-year-old through the remaining months of this. The evaluations, the rearranged weekends, the uncertainty of it. He thought about whether a child needed a father who won the argument, or a father who was simply and reliably there, and whether he had any right to risk the second in pursuit of the first. He did not have an answer. He only had the promise he had made in the dark of her room, and the work and the patience that had gotten him this far. So he sat back down at the table and kept going. The bottom fell out 11 days before the hearing. A piece on a technology industry website appeared on a Monday morning, the kind of short item that gets forwarded before anyone has read it carefully. The story described the software inquiry and described it inaccurately, framing the project as carrying unresolved intellectual property questions tied to a contested divorce proceeding. The language was precise in the way that suggested it had been crafted rather than reported. It read like due diligence. It was designed to read like due diligence. Within a day, the Toronto Fund had requested a pause in the process pending further review. An 8-figure preliminary offer does not disappear in a day. But it can go cold, and Callum felt it cooling in real time, like watching weather change through a window. The same morning, the court received a supplemental filing from Nadine's side, a petition to freeze all assets connected to the software project for the duration of the family proceedings. If granted, it would place the one thing that demonstrated Callum's independent means inside a legal hold until long after the custody question had been decided. Vivienne called him at noon. If the court grants the freeze, the inquiry stalls indefinitely and you lose the only concrete evidence of independent financial capacity we have. Her voice was even, which was how he had come to know that the news was bad. I won't tell you, it's over, but I'll tell you it's the worst position we've been in. Callum stood at the window of the small apartment and looked at the courtyard. The bicycle was still there. The maple on the street beyond the gate had lost everything. And then Vivienne said, "There's one more thing." Her voice changed by a single degree, the same degree he had learned to listen for. I've spent the past week tracing the source of that website piece. It was not a journalist investigating. The specific framing, the IP language, the detail about the divorce connection, that information existed in very few places. It was held by Nadine's counsel, by Nadine, and by Preston. A beat of quiet came down the line. Someone brought that story to a writer, Mr. Dyer, and brought it at exactly the moment it would cause the most damage to the inquiry, and by extension, to your position. Then we find out who, Callum said. We already have most of it. Outside, the afternoon light was moving toward 4 o'clock, which was the color of November in New Westminster. Somewhere across the city, a hearing was 10 days away. Callum hung up the phone and went to wake Iris for dinner. The morning of the hearing was clear and cold, the kind of Vancouver area morning that comes out bright and merciless, as if the weather has no interest in the gravity of what happens under it. Callum had laid out his clothes the night before. He had made Iris her breakfast, walked her to the neighbor's house down the street, crouched at the door to do up her coat, told her he would be back before dinner. Then he had stood at the curb in the early light and waited, because Vivienne had told him a car was coming and to let it. The car that came was a dark gray Porsche Taycan, almost silent, and the man driving it was someone Callum knew by name but had never met in person. Harwick, Desmond Harwick, the principal behind the Toronto Fund, the name at the center of the inquiry, the man who moved the kind of capital that did not usually appear in person at a rental curb in New Westminster at 7:30 in the morning. He reached across and pushed the passenger door open. "Get in," Harwick said. "We've got time. Let's use it." The interior was warm and quiet. Harwick pulled out into the empty morning without explanation, and for several blocks said nothing, letting the city unspool past the windows. "One of my people kept coming back to the same repository," he said at last. "Yours." Said the architecture was the cleanest thing he'd reviewed in 2 years. Said it was sitting in the open under a real name with no pitch attached to it, no deck, no founder positioning himself to be discovered. He glanced over briefly. "You didn't come to us, which is the only reason I went looking for you." A few blocks from the courthouse, he pulled to the curb and put the car in park. Then he did something Callum had not anticipated. He got out, walked around, and held the driver's door open. "You take it from here," Harwick said. "I'll ride in. A man should arrive under his own hands." Something moved behind his eyes, dry and precise. "And it doesn't hurt to let certain people see who's in the passenger seat." Callum understood the shape of the gift, and the cold strategy folded inside the generosity of it. He slid behind the wheel. The courthouse steps were attended when the taken came around the corner. There were a few journalists. The inquiry had entered the press days ago, and a contested custody case, threaded through a multi-million-dollar software deal, was the kind of story that required no embellishment. Nadine's lead attorney was climbing the steps with a document case under one arm. Preston stood near the entrance doors, hands in his pockets, in the posture of a man who has arrived early to a thing he is confident about. The door opened and Callum stepped out. The arrangement on those steps paused. The man who had walked out of that 14th floor boardroom 3 months earlier, with a canvas bag and a sleeping child. The man without paper assets, without documented income, without a position a court could weigh. That man stepped out of a $250,000 car into the November morning, unhurried, alone. Desmond Harwick emerged from the passenger side a moment later and buttoned his jacket in the cold air without comment. And that was the detail that landed, because 2 of the journalists knew the name and the murmur of it moved up the steps like current through a wire. Nadine was already inside. Preston was not. Callum watched the calculation move across Preston's face, a sudden, queasy arithmetic, the expression of someone who has just understood that the board he was looking at has more on it than he had been told. Callum did not look at him long. He walked up the steps and through the doors and into the building where a case everyone had already decided was about to be reconsidered from the beginning. Inside, the room was formal and unhurried. The judge was a woman in her 60s with the patient, experienced look of someone who had spent decades watching people perform certainty and be wrong about it. Nadine's team led with the script Vivienne had predicted, respectful, sympathetic, complete. A devoted but professionally unmoored father. A mother prepared to offer the child stability and structure, and a clear, financial future. They were thorough. They had done this before. Then Vivienne stood. She did not raise her voice once in the next hour. She began with timestamps. She laid out, document by document, the precise sequence of events. The date Nadine filed, the dates of the earliest correspondence between her lawyer and her firm's internal legal team, and set against those dates the first recorded moment of external interest in Callum's software repository. The 2 timelines sat side by side in the record like a diagram. Nadine had not moved in the ordinary rhythm of a marriage ending. She had moved in front of something. She had pushed for a fast and clean dissolution precisely because the inquiry, once it became public, would become a line item on a property inventory, an asset she would have to claim and fight for openly, with a judge and a record. Far simpler to finish the divorce while the man everyone agreed had nothing was still believed to have nothing. The petitioner was not surprised by her husband's circumstances, Vivienne said, in the flat, precise tone of someone reading coordinates. She was informed of them, and she structured the timing of this proceeding to resolve before that information became a legal complication. Nadine's attorney objected. The judge allowed Vivienne to continue. Then came the source of the website piece. Vivienne produced the reconstruction her team had spent 10 days building. The specific language in the article, the details about the divorce and the IP questions, traced back through a sequence of contacts to their origin point. Not a journalist digging. A contact receiving information passed from Preston, through a mutual connection, to a writer who placed it at the precise moment it would damage the inquiry and reduce Callum's only demonstrable leverage. The disruption to the inquiry process, Vivienne said, was not the product of market caution. It was manufactured, and it was manufactured through a party acting in coordination with the petitioner. Something changed in the room, a slow shift, like a change in pressure. Nadine's attorneys were having a quiet, urgent disagreement with each other. Across the room, through the narrow window in the courtroom door, Callum saw Preston turn and walk toward the building's exit with the unhurried pace of a man who has already decided not to be present when a thing concludes. He did not come back. Vivienne built the asset argument the way she had described it to him, in her office months earlier, brick by brick, until the walls stood. His grandmother's estate, received before the marriage, never merged with shared funds, the separate account. The server costs and license fees drawn only from that account. The intellectual property registered in his name. The work performed in the evenings, in the hours the household had already released, funded by money the marriage had never touched, built by one set of hands toward one set of goals that had never been shared because no one had asked about them. She acknowledged the default presumption of the Family Law Act directly, and then she dismantled it, piece by documented piece, until the presumption simply did not have enough ground left to stand on. This was not built with family property, she said, and sat down. The room was quiet. The judge set aside the filings and looked at Callum directly, the look of someone who has finished with the law for the moment and wants to hear the person underneath it. "Mr. Dyer," she said, leaving the financial question to one side, "tell me why you want primary custody of your daughter, not the legal argument, what you would say." Callum stood. He did not reach for the software or the timeline or the asset that had just been found to belong to him. None of that had been the point. It had never been the point. Standing in the quiet of that room, he found he only had one true thing to offer. "A few months ago," he said, "I was putting my daughter to bed the way I do every night, and she asked me if I was going to live with her forever." His voice was level, not loud, just plain. "She wasn't being dramatic. She's 5. She asks me if clouds are heavier than pillows. But I've thought about that question every day since she asked it. Everything I've done since then has been because I made her a promise that I was going to be there. I don't want primary custody because of what I built in a back room, Your Honor. I want it because I'm the one who has been there every day, and I cannot be the reason the answer to her question turns out to be no." No one in the room said anything for a moment. The judge looked at him. Then she made a note, and the silence held, and then she spoke again. The rulings came in order. The petition to freeze the software assets was denied. The inquiry would be permitted to proceed without obstruction. On custody, primary custody was awarded to Callum, with a defined and regular schedule for Nadine. On the property question, the court found that the software system was Callum's separate property, originated before and developed outside the shared resources and shared time of the marriage, funded independently, registered independently, and not subject to division. Nadine received her proper share of the genuine family property, not a dollar more. Callum watched her receive the ruling without expression. She had counted every factor before the process began, and she had counted one factor wrong, and the only evidence of it was a quality of stillness in her face that had not been there in the boardroom 3 months earlier. Outside, on the courthouse steps in the cold November light, Desmond Harwick was waiting with his hands in his coat pockets. He offered his hand, and Callum took it. "I want to tell you why I drove out to New Westminster this morning," Harwick said. "It wasn't the repository. I'd already made the decision about the repository before I got in the car." He held the handshake a moment longer than necessary. "I wanted to see how you carried yourself under the weight of it. You can learn almost everything you need to know about a person by watching what they do when they're losing." He let go. "You held it." "We'll finish the paperwork this week." The deal closed before the month was out. Callum did not tell anyone. He did not post anything, did not call around with the news. What he did with the first significant money of his life was put a deposit on a small house in Burnaby, a one-story place on a corner lot, a yard that needed considerable work, a porch that looked out at a row of birch trees that had not yet been cleared. It was not impressive. It was his, and it was Iris's, and that was the precise measure of what it needed to be. The first night in the new house he made dinner because routine had held him through everything, and he saw no reason to stop relying on it now. He helped Iris arrange her room. He found the right shelf for the rabbits and the right corner for the small lamp she insisted on. When she was asleep and the house had settled into its own quiet for the first time, he poured a cup of tea and took it out to the porch and sat in the cold night air and let himself feel for a while the simple weight of having kept his word. He saw Nadine once more, about 2 months later. A school event, the gymnasium of Iris's school, folding chairs, children performing a short play about animals who learned to share. Nadine was composed, which he had never doubted she would be. There was something in her expression that had not been there before. A careful quality, like a person moving through a room differently than they once had. He had heard, in the way these things travel, that whatever had existed between her and Preston had not held past the exposure of what they had arranged together. He did not take any satisfaction in it, which still surprised him slightly. They stood near the back and said a few civil sentences about Iris's schedule, about a school form that needed both their signatures, about a December concert coming up. It was not warm and it was not cold. It was two people who shared a child and a mutual history and very little else. When the gymnasium began to empty, Nadine turned to leave, and then stopped and looked back at him with an expression he could not entirely read. "I didn't know what it was," she said quietly. "The software. I knew you were building something, but I didn't know what it would become." Callum looked at her for a moment. There was a version of this conversation that had lived in the back of his mind for months. The things that could be said, some of them true, and some of them simply satisfying in the imagining. He let that version go. "I know," he said. He turned and crossed the gymnasium to where Iris was waiting for him at the edge of the small stage, still wearing the paper ears from the performance, holding them in place with both hands. He crouched down and fixed them, and she grabbed his hand, and they walked out together into the dark of a Vancouver December, into the ordinary cold of it, into everything that had held through all of it and was still standing.